You're listening to Soundside. I'm supervising producer Sarah Leibovitz. The war in Ukraine is causing tremendous and likely lasting psychological damage to generations of its young people. Some of that trauma is caused by what's tantamount to kidnapping by the Russian government. According to a new report by the think tank GlobSec, there have been nearly 20,000 cases of what it calls forcibly transferred or deported children. These children are taken from their homes and placed in camps or with Russian families. Today I'm talking with two people who are associated with the report. Eric Trupin is a psychologist and a professor at the University of Washington School of Medicine. He wrote the foreword for the report, which is titled Stolen Generations, a Systemic Violation of Ukraine's Future. For the last 2 years, Dr. Trupin has also trained mental health providers in Ukraine in how to use poetry and other techniques to help young people process emotions and cope with intense trauma. It's a project that was created originally as a way to help young incarcerated people here in Seattle. I'm also speaking with Yulia Osmolovska, head of the GlobSec Kyiv office. Eric, Yulia, thank you both for being here.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for inviting.
And a warning for listeners, this conversation includes discussion of violence, including sexual violence against children. Yulia, I want to start with you because you are based in Ukraine. So last week, President Trump announced a 50-day buffer before he would implement severe tariffs on Russia, assuming the nation hasn't reached a peace deal with Ukraine. We're going to get to the recent report by GlobSec in a second, but I want to start by just asking, how are things on the ground in Ukraine right now? Have the peace negotiations or the tariff announcements changed anything for you?
Oh, no, definitely not. Let me put two layers to this answer. First is in terms of making Russia more pressed to achieve a ceasefire within these 50 days. It's definitely a non-attainable goal because Russia doesn't have any kind of extra leverage placed on them in order to change their behavior in negotiations. So this is why the majority of Ukrainian top experts in foreign policy and security field are quite skeptical about the chances of reaching a ceasefire within the next year and a half. Actually, and this is something that we highlighted in our another report, 7 security scenarios around the war in Ukraine for next year and a half. On second effect within this 50 days framework, it's about the question whether this would change Russian behavior against the civilians. So meaning that whether there will be less drone and missiles and combined attacks on civilian population, less victims among civilians and children, of course, included, would be expected within this time frame. Unfortunately, again, the negative answer. Even more than that, we do expect that Russians will be intensifying these attacks on civilian population because what they want to achieve, they want to have this psychological effect for the population to live in constant fear, tiredness, anxiety, and actually demands the government to get into imperfect peace solution, meaning actually the surrender in Russian terms. So what they're doing right now is they're increasing psychological pressure on the population.
Let's get into specifically one way that they are increasing and have put psychological pressure onto the population, and that's what's detailed in your recent report by GlobSec. What is happening to young people in Ukraine right now?
Well, I think this is definitely the most vulnerable category of Ukrainians who are living under this psychological pressure. And I would identify broadly 4 major groups of young Ukrainians. First is internally displaced person that has to move from the occupied territories, then those who stayed there and live in the temporary occupied territories. For these, our government official estimate it's 1.5 billion of young Ukrainians living there. So we also have refugees, which is the big category of young Ukrainians. And to our knowledge, this is the most vulnerable when it comes to psychological traumas and PTSD, because on top of what they've experienced in Ukraine, they also encountered with some uncertainty, unknown environments, probably language barrier and all this stuff. So definitely another challenge to get them accommodated in the new environment, which also put the pressure. Plus, on top of that, they still have relatives back in Ukraine for which they're worried very much, and they still have their air alerts tools on their mobiles to check every time when there is attack on Ukraine, whether their city is affected, whether their families are affected. So basically, and also we have the category that you mentioned, we designed a specific report for them. It's called Stolen Generation. So it's about deported and forcefully displaced Ukrainian children to Russian territory. So all these categories are suffering from different kind of psychological traumas, definitely. And a lot of them either experienced or witnessed hostilities themselves. They might saw the loss of their family member, mothers and fathers and sisters, brothers. They was or they were or currently are under occupation. They also might be suffered from tortures when, for instance, Kiev region had been occupied for some short time, but we had so well-known infamous atrocities in Bucha and in the Irpin, in many other small cities around Kiev. Also, they might be like hostages, like blocked in their houses when the occupation. I can give you a number of examples of that. So basically, all this stuff has a tremendous negative impact on the children psycho. And I think that our good and trusted friend, Professor Trupin, would elaborate on that much more.
Yeah, Dr. Trupin, if you don't mind jumping in, I know you've been to Ukraine multiple times to meet with these children and help develop practices to help them process what is happening. What have you seen during these visits?
Well, what I've seen is incredible courage, first of all, the capacity of the Ukrainian people to show resilience, resistance to what is a mean, cruel invasion by Russian forces who have no sense of humanity in terms of the Ukrainian people and are willing to use any strategy, any procedure to demean and undermine the sense of self-worth of the Ukrainian people, and particularly for children. So there has been a pervasive effort to undermine a sense of well-being for a whole population. And what is I see and what is so impressive is the courage of not just soldiers who are incredibly resourceful and capable of tremendous acts of courage, but of young people, of mothers. I think that what has impressed me so much is the mothers of some of these young people who have been kidnapped. Their willingness to be tenacious and persistent in not allowing their children to be who have been taken away from them, to persist in demanding their return. In fact, I've met a number of mothers who've actually walked into Russia, banged on the doors of these camps, and demanded their children be returned. So, you know, the sense of courage is something that is so incredibly impressive. The consequences to young people are profound, and the way in which one gets trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder is by being in a circumstance where you see something awful occurring, either to someone else or to someone you love or to yourself, and you can't do anything about it. So we have here in this country a high incidence of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder by a variety of populations. But in Ukraine, it's a profound number of young people have experiences. So the impact of this war is pervasive. everyone experiences it to some degree. But the young people who I've been, or at least I was working with, have actually had kidnapping or some kind of experience like that. Let me just say, when I use the term working with, I'm using it in the past. The staff at the organization I was working with, called Save Ukraine, was very much involved in trying to rehouse people who have lost their homes due to the war, or to bring back young people who have been kidnapped or brought into into Russia, but also bringing back the vast number of people who have had to leave where they live and gone to other countries. What we've experienced was, we were running this program which was helping young people express themselves through poetry, through writing, which is a very effective way for young people to be able to talk about the experience. But on the day that our US government stopped supporting USAID, the staff at the mental health staff at this organization called Save Ukraine were all being paid through USAID, and they were let go. So we've had to, just like we've had to suspend our program, because the staff we were working with and training in this approach no longer exists.
Got it. So right now, that is not happening with Save Ukraine.
Right.
Yulia, you were going to jump in there.
Yeah, I wanted to add, just to illustrate the picture that Eric has been drawing. So basically, when the war started, I call us as a responsible expert community, we started to help the government to inform the international audience about what's happening in Ukraine. And before everything settled, because you can imagine that first couple of weeks, it's a complete house. So we started to collect all the information from the media internally in Ukraine, what's happening, and to put it in daily briefs to enlighten the international audience of what's happened. So me personally, I had to process a lot of children's stories myself with pictures. But for instance, one was struck me very much was the letter that a 9-year girl wrote to her mother to Haven. Because the girl witnessed when they had been in evacuation caravan in a car, the Russians shoot them down. So the mom covered with her body the daughter. So this is how the girl was saved, but mom was died. And then she wrote a letter to her in Haven by promising that she would behave as her mother taught her, in order for them to get reconnected in Haven. And then she said, this is a phrase that I always cry when I try to recall it. She said, "Thank you for the best 9 years of my life." So it's really compelling. Or the other story, when the guy they had been hiding in a house in Mariupol, and they had been starving, all of them, because people didn't have the food and so on. So mom eventually died in the eyes of the young 6-year-old boy. And then she was buried in the yard near the house, because they didn't allow even the bodies to get transmitted to some civilized places to get buried. So when they got access to food, he started to go and to visit the grave every day, feeding his mom there. So he was leaving pieces of bread and some juice and so on. And there are plenty of stories like that. So also to put some numbers, because I want your listeners to understand the scale of this problem. It's actually, before the war, we had like 7 million something of young Ukrainians aged under 18. And during the war, we had immigration of almost 2 million of young Ukrainians somewhere abroad. And also, as I mentioned, 1.5 million still live in these temporary occupied territories. And you can imagine that what might be happening to these children.
Yeah. And Yulia, your report also goes into why Russia would prioritize specifically the forced deportation and assimilation of Ukrainian children, but also just kind of this focus on young people in Ukraine as a war strategy. Can you explain like how specifically would this benefit, Russia to put this kind of focus and labor into specifically children in Ukraine?
Yeah, there are a couple of layers to that as well, but I should start with by saying that it's probably the largest scale child abduction in history that we're witnessing right now, and also deliberate ethnic cleansing campaign that Russians are doing. For instance, again, I haven't mentioned for ethical reasons, but I have to refer to it somehow, sexual violence that is happening against young children in Ukraine. And when we had these dead bodies of children discovered, they had severely damaged their reproductive organs. And so a lot of them had been raped in very brutal manner. And then we got some of explanation coming from, I think, detained Russian soldiers, that they were instructed to do so because what they wanted to achieve, they wanted to create this kind of disgust of young Ukrainians to any kind of reproduction, sex, and all this stuff in order for them not to be able to reproduce themselves in the future. This is one thing. Second thing, those who are forcefully deported to Russia, they are being forcefully indoctrinated into Russian culture. So when I said ethnical cleansing, this is about completely evaporating the sense of Ukrainian identity. They change their names. They prohibit them from speaking Ukrainian. They mentioned that the country has betrayed them and Russia is a savior. And if a child is not agreeing with this kind of imposed reality, so there is internal protest to that. And probably Professor Trupin would describe this, what's happening with child psycho, better in this way. But by doing that, Russians are trying to create this sense of hatred of indoctrinated Ukrainians against Ukraine, for them to be able then to be part of this new Russian army that at some point will do same kind of atrocities, same kind of hostilities in Ukraine, in sort of revenge to the country. This is clearly seen by very intense Russian campaign to do these youth camps where they teach young children how to mine territory, how to use a gun, how to use a machine gun, and all this stuff. And a lot of them they take forcefully from the occupied territories. So this is one of the very, very big problem when it comes to what they're doing and why they see that this is an asset in their military campaign totally. To add some spice to that, I should also mention some numbers. For instance, when we're talking about how many of Ukrainians have been deported to Russia, Russians themselves, their children ombudsman, Maria Belova, she confessed, Lvova Belova, she confessed that they have roughly 700,000 of Ukrainian children taken to Russia and dispersed in their big territory. It takes a lot of time to identify, to verify children who have been forcefully deported to Russia. And to the date, the government of Ukraine managed, out of this alleged 700,000, to identify and verify only something around 20,000 of children, out of which only 1,300 something have been returned to Ukraine for these 4 years. So it gives you a sense, and to your listener, an idea how laborious this process is. And each case is very individual, very sensitive. There are many people involved in this process. A lot of them are under severe pressure and expose themselves to risks when they're working on Russian territory. So you could imagine the scale of this problem that we are facing.
I think the scale of the problem is so pronounced in the potential consequences for this whole population of young people, unless they are provided with some support and effective interventions, the trajectory for them as they grow up is to have serious emotional problems. But what it often turns into is anger when they become adolescents and young people, because of the distress they feel and the sense of not having power. So it is so essential that there be interventions and programs that really support these young people and the families. Incredibly difficult to do in the face of this war that goes on and the ambivalence of the United States in terms of being helpful and supportive. Ukrainian people have at least my experience, an incredible fondness for Americans and for the help that the United States has provided. But there's such a sense of being abandoned by people, by the Ukrainian people, and in a circumstance where we were perceived and actually doing really good in so many ways, not just in a military way, but supporting Ukrainian people in terms of doing remedies for around health and mental health and other things. So it's essential that we reconnect and re-support, particularly some of these other areas that have been undermined and reduced.
This is such a difficult and heavy topic, and there's so much here to understand. We could keep talking about this for a full hour and not even touch the surface of everything that is happening. But Dr. Trupin, I want to ask you maybe like a bit of a broader question right now. There are so many children in crisis everywhere, Sudan, in Gaza, in addition, of course, to Ukraine. Based on your experience, what you've seen in Ukraine, what you hear about, from your colleagues there, from your work, what are you worried about, or what do you think about with these children in conflict zones around the world? Like, what should people who are hearing this and are like, I want to help, or I want to know what to do, what do you want them to know?
There is something essential about child development and children and young people having a sense of safety when they grow up, and the consequences of not feeling safe and not being taken care of lead to awful outcomes for young people, be it depression, anxiety, inability to control their rage. So if we don't take steps to reduce these kinds of experiences, we're going to have many, many young people around the world who have a hard time functioning in relationships, have a hard time dealing with their own anxieties and their distress. So it's in our best interest, not just for the children's best interest, it's in our best interest to see what we can do to prevent these things from happening, but to address them while they're happening. And there are strategies. This is not it is desperate in terms of certain families and their experiences, but there are strategies, there are approaches that actually improve the likelihood that someone is going to be able to improve and be treated effectively. So I think we pay attention to that, and they're way less expensive than things that would happen later on in the lives of young people, of the consequences of them not becoming effective adolescents or young adults.
Dr. Eric Trupin is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Washington Medical Center. He's a child psychologist who has worked with incarcerated youth for decades. And Yulia Osmolovska is head of the GlobSec Kyiv office. Thank you both so much for taking the time to talk with me. Yulia, I want to give you the final word. Is there anything that you would like our Seattle audience to know or to be thinking about to take away from this conversation?
Yes, definitely. I just forgot to mention when I started to say that international audience and the international community try to assist Ukraine and help Ukraine. And within the United States, we also have very good motion. For instance, the resolution has been submitted in the US Senate to recognize that no peace is there with Russia without the return of all abducted children. And if we're talking about the numbers of 700,000 alleged numbers, non-verified because it's difficult, but at least this should be something on the agenda of the American partners when they approached Russians, when they put pressure on Russians. And if it is in your capacity to support this resolution, to support it through your selected members of Congress in your region, I think it would be very, very great. So this resolution was submitted by Republican Chuck Grassley and Democrat Amy Klobuchar. And
Amy Klobuchar.
I think that this is something that we definitely would welcome as significant impact, even from this short but very important radio program that you invited me in. Thank you.
Thank you again both so much for taking the time.
Thank you for inviting.
And again, the name of that GlobSec report is Stolen Generations, a Systemic Violation of Ukraine's Future.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.